The building woke up in layers. First, the HVAC system, then the elevator motors, then the slow accumulation of footsteps on marble that meant the day was becoming real. Cole Merritt heard all of it
This is
before he saw any
completely
of it.
unacceptable.
I
He
was
on
just
the
doing my
38th
job.
floor at 6:45
Your job, you
in
crossed the
morning,
line.
This is
crouched beside a
ridiculous.
coffee station replacing a filtration cartridge that should have been swapped 2 weeks ago according to the maintenance log no one else had read. The building hummed around him the way buildings hum when they think no one is listening, with small mechanical confessions about everything that was starting to fail. He worked with his left shoulder angled slightly toward the hall. Not consciously. The way breathing wasn't conscious, the way checking exits wasn't something he decided to do anymore. It was just something that happened. A calculation completed before the question was even asked. 3 points of entry to this stretch of floor. Service stairwell behind him. Main elevator bank 40 feet south. Secondary stairwell past the copy alcove. He knew the weight of each door, how long each took to swing open, whether the hinges announced themselves. He had learned the building the way he had learned every building he'd ever worked in, not from a blueprint from walking it alone at 6 in the morning when the marble echoed and the glass reflected nothing but his own gray uniform. The uniform said C. Merritt above the left breast pocket in small blue thread. He had looked at it in the locker room mirror on his first day 16 months ago and felt something he couldn't name, not embarrassment, not satisfaction, something more like relief. The kind of relief that comes when you've finally settled into the smallest possible version of yourself and discovered that the smallness is the point. He finished with the filter, stood, rolled his neck once to the left. The joint didn't pop anymore. He'd stopped expecting it to. He gathered his kit, checked that the station was clean, and pushed the cart toward the service corridor. As he moved, his eyes completed their circuit, north wall, south wall, the long bank of floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over Lake Michigan in the gray before sunrise, the water and the sky, the same shade of nothing. Chicago in October at this hour was a city still deciding whether it wanted to exist. He stopped at the service elevator and pressed the call button. Waited. The thing about silence was that it was never actually silent. There was always something underneath a frequency, a pressure, the particular quality of air in a space that told you whether the space was empty or only appeared to be. Cole had been trained to read that difference. He no longer thought about the training. It had become indistinguishable from instinct, which was the point of training in the first place. The elevator arrived. He loaded the cart, pressed B2, watched the doors close. His locker in the basement maintenance room was the third from the left on the east wall. He had chosen it on his first day for reasons he didn't articulate to himself. It was close to the exit. It sat in the visual blind spot of the security camera mounted above the row, and the locker to its left had a damaged hinge that made a sound before it opened. Not a security measure, not exactly. More like muscle memory operating at a frequency below conscious thought, arranging the small geography of daily life the way water finds the path of least resistance. Not because it decides to, because that's what water does. Inside the locker, taped to the door at eye level, was a drawing. Crayon on construction paper. 2 figures in front of a house, one tall and one small. The tall one's hands enormous. Grace's theory of proportion, which held that the most important part of a person should be the biggest. Underneath, in the handwriting of a 7-year-old who had recently discovered that letters could be made to sit more or less on a line if you tried hard enough. Home is where Dad is. He looked at it for 3 seconds. Exactly 3. Then he changed into his uniform and clocked in at 6:48. He did not keep a photo of Sarah in the locker. He kept it in the drawer of the nightstand at home, the one on the left side of the bed, the side that had been hers. He opened that drawer every morning before he left, and every night before he slept. Not to look at the photo he had. The photo had memorized it in the first month after the accident, the way you memorize things that can be taken from you, but as a form of acknowledgement. She had existed. She still did in the specific gravity Grace brought to a room, in the way the girl approached problems sideways rather than straight on, in the particular brand of stubborn optimism that had no genetic explanation except one. Frank Kowalski lived 3 houses down on the same block in Cicero. His wife Helen had started offering to take Grace in the mornings about 6 weeks after the accident, quietly, without fanfare, in the way that people who have actually lived through hard things understand that what you need in the first months is not casseroles or condolences, but someone to absorb the logistics of survival. Cole had accepted because Grace liked Helen, and because he had learned that refusing help when you needed it was a form of pride he could no longer afford. Grace was 7. She liked marine biology, fractions only in theory, strawberry ice cream, and the books in the Magic Treehouse series, which she was systematically rereading in a different order each time to see if the story changed. It didn't, she had told Cole gravely, but the feeling changed. He had thought about that for a while afterward, turning it over. He hadn't told her it was the smartest thing he'd heard in years. He'd just said, "Yeah, I think you're right," and she'd nodded. Like this confirmed something she'd suspected. She had not spoken for 4 months after Sarah died. Not a word, not a sound beyond the functional pointing when she needed something, nodding or shaking her head. The therapist had said this was within the range of trauma response in children her age, which Cole had noted was not the same as saying it was okay. He had sat on the floor of her room every night during those 4 months, not talking, just present while she slept, and he watched the ceiling and did the breathing exercise he'd been taught in a context he did not think about and had not thought about in a very long time. 4 counts in, 4 counts hold, 4 counts out. The morning she spoke again, she had come into the kitchen where he was standing over the stove and said she wanted oatmeal, please, with the brown sugar, not the white. He had turned away from the stove and stood at the kitchen window for 60 seconds looking out at the backyard without saying anything. Then he'd made her oatmeal with the brown sugar. She had eaten it at the table with the focused pleasure of someone returned to the world after a long absence, and she hadn't mentioned the 4 months, and neither had he, and they had simply continued from there. The quarterly leadership meeting began at 9. Cole knew this because he had changed all the filters in the Floor 38 coffee stations the previous Tuesday, which meant he was not scheduled to return to that floor until Thursday, which meant when his supervisor flagged him at 8:50 and told him the West Station was running slow and could he take a look before the meeting, he knew something about the timing. He took a look. The station wasn't slow. Someone had bumped the selector dial and changed the brew strength. He reset it, wiped down the surface, was folding his cloth and preparing to leave when the room filled. They came in the way people come into rooms when the room is a theater, and they are both the audience and the performance, with the slightly heightened alertness of people who know they are being seen. Senior vice presidents in suits that cost what Cole earned in 2 months. Department heads who had spent the previous evening deciding which thing to say at this meeting that would make them sound like the kind of person who should be in this meeting. A scattering of junior analysts at the perimeter doing the opposite calculation, trying to be precisely noticeable enough to justify their presence, and not 1 degree more. Cole moved toward the service corridor. He was almost there when the crack of heels on marble changed the quality of the room. He knew the sound before he turned. Fast, deliberate, the kind of stride that treated every surface as something to be covered rather than occupied. He turned anyway, not because he needed to, because the room had gone quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when the person who defines the room has entered it. Caroline Hargrove was 47 years old and moved like someone who had decided a long time ago that the world would have to rearrange itself to accommodate her pace rather than the reverse. She wore a dark suit that cost nothing and communicated everything, and her hair was pinned back with the efficiency of someone who had stopped thinking about her hair sometime in her late 30s and had not missed it. She was beautiful in the way that severe things are beautiful: a cliff face, a winter storm, a mathematical proof. There was nothing soft about it, and it was not trying to be anything other than what it was. Cole had seen her before. She was in the building most mornings, took the private elevator to 42, occasionally crossed through 38 on her way to client meetings. He had been in her proximity perhaps a dozen times in 16 months. She had never looked at him. She looked at everything else, the reports her assistant carried, the faces of people waiting to speak to her, the horizon of whatever problem she was currently solving, with the attentiveness of someone who considered inattention a moral failing. She simply did not look at maintenance staff the way you don't look at furniture, not because you disrespect it, because your mind has categorized it as outside the set of things requiring your attention. She was heading for the front of the room. Cole was heading for the door. They were not going to intersect. He had 6 feet of clearance and the door was right there. What happened next happened in the time it takes for a hand to shake. Derek Walsh was 27 years old and 8 months into his first real job and had been standing at the edge of the refreshment table holding his coffee with both hands and trying very hard to look like someone who was thinking about something important rather than trying not to spill. Cole had clocked him on the way in the particular stillness of someone whose hands are betraying them, the whitening of knuckles, the coffee swaying in the cup with a slow, predictable rhythm. He had also clocked that Derek was standing exactly where someone would stand if they startled easily, and there was a loud sound which there was when Caroline Hargrove's heel caught the threshold strip and the room's energy shifted with her entrance. Derek's hands moved. The cup didn't fall, it tipped, pivoted, and the coffee went in a slow arc that had the horrible dreamlike quality of things that cannot be stopped once they've started. Dark liquid spread across the pale carpet, in a stain that kept growing the way spilled things do past the point where it seemed possible for so much to have come from so little. The room saw it. Then the room saw Caroline Hargrove see it. She stopped, turned, and Cole watched the calculation happen in real time behind her eyes, not cruelty, not yet something more clinical than that. She was identifying the nearest element of disorder in her environment and assigning accountability with the same efficiency she applied to everything else. She did not look at Derek, whose face had gone the specific color of a person watching an accident happen that they cannot stop and are responsible for. She looked at Cole. You. One word. Not loud. The kind of voice that doesn't need volume because it has been trained to carry to land, to stick. What is this? Not a question. A declaration of a problem in need of immediate resolution. Cole looked at the stain. He looked at Derek, whose right hand still held the empty cup and whose eyes were moving between Cole and Caroline with the trapped animal calculation of someone working out which direction represented the lesser danger. Cole held the look for exactly long enough to confirm what he already knew: Derek wasn't going to speak. The boy had learned in 8 months what the room taught everyone eventually, that speaking up in this environment was a transaction with costs that were visible in advance and benefits that were not. Cole looked at Caroline. He held her gaze for 3 seconds, not defiant, not submissive, the look of a man who has been looked at by people far more dangerous than a corporate executive and has learned that the look itself is neutral. It is what you bring to it that gives it meaning. Then he knelt. He pulled the cloth from his belt and pressed it into the carpet, worked the stain in the slow, circular motion that meant something in the body's understanding of the task, not performance, not compliance, just the physical intelligence of a person doing what the moment requires without wasting energy on what it means. Caroline watched him for a moment. Then she addressed the room. "This," she said, her voice carrying to every corner without apparent effort, "is the cost of inattention. $60,000 of carpet installed 3 months ago. 90 minutes is all I ask. 90 minutes in which the room stays in the condition it was in when we walked into it." She let the silence make its point. Some people never rise above their station because they've never understood that every station has standards. Several people in the room shifted. A few looked at the floor. Not one of them spoke. Cole finished with the stain. He stood. He gathered his cloth and his kit, and he walked toward the service corridor. As he passed Derek Walsh, he slowed not enough to draw attention enough to be audible to one person at a range of 2 feet. "It wasn't your fault." A pause. "Keep coming to work." Derek's chin moved. Cole was already through the door. So, the service elevator was fluorescent lit and smelled of industrial cleaner and the particular staleness of enclosed spaces that see a lot of use and very little attention. Cole pressed B2. The doors closed. He stood with his cart and his kit in the buzzing silence and did the breathing exercise without deciding to. 4 and 4, hold 4 out. His hands were steady. They were always steady. This was not a quality he was proud of. It was simply the result of a great deal of specific work done over a long time in conditions that no longer existed, leaving behind only the residue of capacity like the callus left by a tool you no longer carry. He thought about Derek Walsh. 27 8 months in the careful way he'd been holding that cup. The boy would go home tonight and replay the morning and find 100 moments where he could have done something differently, and none of those moments would be the actual problem. The actual problem was that he worked in a place where the cost of a visible mistake was borne not by the person who made it, but by whatever happened to be nearest when the mistake landed. Cole understood that system from the inside. He had been inside different versions of it for a long time. He changed out of his uniform in the locker room, checked the drawing on the locker door, went through the inventory sheet for his afternoon. 2 light fixture replacements on 19 quarterly HVAC filter, check on 22, and a work order from the previous week. About a faint electrical smell somewhere on the east side of 22 that the building engineer had flagged, and that Cole had been thinking about since he read it, not because it was unusual, but because electrical smells that manifest intermittently have a specific failure pattern, and the pattern was one he'd noted before the work order ever landed. He ate lunch in the basement break room, a thermos of coffee and a sandwich he'd made that morning while Grace was getting dressed. Frank Kowalski had walked past the kitchen on his way to the front door at 6:15 and said without stopping, "You're going to make her a peanut butter person if you keep that up." Cole had said, "She already is one." Frank had said, "Like father," and left without finishing the sentence, which was its own kind of compliment. Frank had been in the Marines, 3 tours. He'd come back from the last one with a stillness that his wife Helen had told Cole early on had taken her 2 years to stop finding frightening. Cole understood what she meant. He had his own version of that stillness acquired in a different branch of service that did not have a name anyone used in polite company. He and Frank had never spoken about this directly. They'd had one conversation about 6 weeks after Cole moved to the block that had circled the subject the way 2 people circle the thing they're both thinking about without saying it, and then landed somewhere adjacent. Frank talking about a specific moment in Helmand Province, Cole saying he understood that kind of moment, and Frank looking at him for a beat and then nodding, and that had been enough. The topic had not come up again. It didn't need to. The afternoon went normally until it didn't. Cole was on 22 at 2:40 in the afternoon, crouched in the HVAC access panel in the east corridor, working through the filter rotation. He had already noted within 30 seconds of being on the floor that the electrical smell was present today. Faint, non-continuous, triggered by the fan cycling, which meant it was coming from the wiring running parallel to the duct on the east side, not from the unit itself. He had made a note on his work order form with the specific location and a recommendation for an electrician to inspect before the end of the week. He would give it to his supervisor when he got back downstairs. The supervisor would route it to building engineering. Building engineering would schedule it for the following week, which was not ideal but was probably within the margin. He was thinking about this, or rather holding it in the background the way you hold information you intend to act on when the smell changed. Not stronger, different. The particular difference between the low-level thermal complaint of insulation under prolonged stress and the acute signature of something that had moved past stress into event. Cole came out of the access panel on one motion, stood in the corridor and turned east, following the smell the way you follow a sound in a space you can't see, not with your eyes, with everything else. He had his hand on his radio to call it in when the building's fire alarm system arrived at the same conclusion he had and expressed it with considerably less restraint. The sound was the kind of sound that tells the body something has changed before the mind catches up, not the practiced politeness of a drill. The real thing, long unbroken, indifferent to whatever anyone had been planning to do next. The sound that turns a building full of professionals into a building full of animals who need to locate the exit. Cole's radio came alive immediately. Frank's voice, ground floor security. 22 East. Sprinkler system partial failure East Zone. I have reports of personnel on the floor. Multiple. I cannot confirm evacuation status. Cole was already moving. I'm on 22. Give me 30 seconds. He went east. The smoke was visible at the end of the corridor before he reached it. Gray rolling along the ceiling in the specific way that meant the source was below the ceiling level and the ceiling was reflecting it back, which meant the fire itself was still contained, but the smoke was not, which gave him a window that was real but not generous. He dropped low, left hand to the wall. He had mapped this floor in his first week on the job because mapping floors was something he did because you never needed the map until you did, and by then it was too late to make one. The server room was at the end of the east corridor behind a fire door that was now buckled inward on its lower left hinge. A section of ceiling had come down across the frame, a tangle of drywall and conduit that had wedged the door rather than sealed it, which was the difference between a barrier and an obstacle. Cole assessed it in 3 seconds. He gripped the edge of the largest ceiling panel and pulled. It didn't move. He reset, dropped his hips, drove through his legs, and pulled again with the specific quality of force that comes from knowing exactly which muscles to use and exactly in what order, which is not the same as strength, though it requires it. The panel groaned and gave 6 inches. He found the next anchor point shifted, pulled again. Inside through the gap he'd made 3 faces, 2 standing, 1 on the floor. Marcus Shaw, 28. One of the IT department's network technicians. Cole knew him by sight, had nodded to him in the lobby probably 30 times. Denise Porter, 33, senior systems analyst. He knew her name from the building directory and her face from the elevator. Both of them were standing functional, frightened in the productive way that meant they would follow instructions. The third person on the floor against the east wall was a man Cole did not recognize, and what Cole recognized instead was the angle of his left leg, which was the angle of a leg whose femur had failed, and the expression on his face, which was the expression of someone who has tried to stand and discovered that the architecture of their body has changed. "Can you walk?" Cole said it to the man on the floor because the answer to that question was the axis on which everything else would turn. "No. I tried. I can't." "What's your name?" "Ryan. Ryan Mercer." "Ryan, I'm going to carry you out. It's going to hurt. When it hurts, you're going to want to fight me. Don't." Cole turned to Marcus and Denise. "You two go left wall, on your left. West stairwell is 40 feet. Door will be warm. Use your sleeve on the handle. Go all the way to the lobby. Do not stop on any floor. Go now." "Denise, what about—" "I have him. Go." They went. Cole knelt beside Ryan Mercer and explained in 4 sentences what he was going to do and what Ryan needed to do, which was nothing except not resist. And Ryan, who was the kind of person who understands that the moment you are lying on the floor of a burning building with a broken leg is not the moment to negotiate, said okay. And Cole lifted him. The motion was practiced in the way that certain things become practiced when you have done them in conditions where doing them wrong has permanent consequences. Not smooth. Ryan's leg shifted as Cole pulled him across his shoulders, and the sound Ryan made was not a scream and not a sob, but something between them that belonged to a category of human sound that exists only at the intersection of severe pain and determined endurance. Cole said, "Breathe, in through your nose, focus on my voice." "Ryan, it hurts." "Got it. I know. Keep breathing. Tell me what you do." "What?" "Your job. Tell me what you do." A pause. Cole was already moving east corridor, low left wall. "Network security. I manage the firewalls." "Firewalls?" Cole heard his own voice even and steady below the sound of the alarm and the building's structural complaint as heat worked its way through materials not designed to tolerate it. "That's either ironic or appropriate. I can't decide." A sound from Ryan that might have been the beginning of a laugh truncated by a fresh wave of pain as Cole adjusted his weight on the descent. "Both," Ryan managed. "Probably both." "Good. Stay with that. Keep talking." They went down, floor by floor, Cole counting landings the way he counted everything in spaces like this, not because the count was the point, because counting was the tool that kept the mind organized when the body was fully occupied. 15, 13, 11. Ryan's voice went intermittent on 9 more breath than words. Cole shifted his weight and said his name. Got a response. 8. 6. Ryan's grip on Cole's forearm loosened with the specific quality of loosening that meant the body was starting to prioritize other things. Ryan. No response. Ryan Mercer. A sound low, the sound of someone very far down a long corridor toward unconsciousness. Cole accelerated. 3. 2. He came through the lobby door into light and sound in the organized chaos of emergency response. Firefighters moving in as building staff moved out. 2 paramedics with a gurney already in motion toward the far wall. Cole crossed the lobby floor with Ryan Mercer across his shoulders in a way that parted the crowd without asking it to part the way certain kinds of movement make their own space. Medic. His voice landed clean through the noise, not loud, the way voices land when they have been trained to carry information rather than volume. Broken left femur smoke inhalation was conscious until the 8th floor. He was responsive 3 minutes ago. The paramedics had the gurney positioned before he finished the sentence. Cole lowered Ryan onto it with the care of a man who understands the difference between getting the job done and getting it done without causing additional damage. Ryan's eyes opened once, not fully, just enough to establish that there was still something behind them looking out. He said something that Cole didn't catch. Cole said, "You're out, it's done," and stepped back. He stepped back into the space where Frank Kowalski was standing. Frank had the particular stillness of a man who has seen a great many things and has learned to receive them without visible reaction. He was looking at Cole the way Cole had been looked at before, not by a superior, by an equal, by someone who understands the category of action they have just witnessed and is doing the arithmetic on what category of person it implies. Frank said, "You went up." Cole said, "There were people on the floor." A beat. Then Frank said quietly, the word that Cole had not heard in 3 years, the word that lived in the part of his history that had been sealed and set aside ironwood. Cole went still. Not with surprise, with the specific quality of stillness that is a trained response to the sound of a name that should not exist in a particular context. A stillness so complete and so brief that if you weren't watching for it, you would miss it. Frank was watching for it. Cole said nothing. He looked at Frank for exactly 2 seconds. Then he looked at Ryan Mercer being loaded into the ambulance. Then he turned and walked toward the bench near the security desk where he sat down and pulled off his smoke-stained maintenance shirt and folded it neatly and set it beside him. There was a man standing near the building entrance who had not been there when the alarm went off. Cole knew this the way he knew most things, not from a specific observation, but from the accumulated record of the space that his mind maintained without being asked to. The man was 68 or 70, silver-haired, with the posture of someone who has spent decades in rooms where posture signals membership. He was watching Cole with the expression of a person who has just confirmed something they were not entirely certain of, an expression that combined recognition with something more complicated. Not surprised, the specific gravity of a debt that has been waiting to come due. Cole looked at him once. The man held the look without flinching. Cole looked away first, which was not submission, which was the choice of a person who prefers not to have a conversation that he is not yet ready to have. He sat on the bench, picked up his radio, called his supervisor to confirm the floor was evacuated and to file a report on the filter access panel he'd left open at 2:40. His voice was even. His hands resting on his knees were steady. Outside, Chicago continued, sirens converging from 3 directions. People clustered on the sidewalk in the particular posture of people who have been ejected from their ordinary day without warning and have not yet decided what to do next. The sky above the lake was the gray of late afternoon, moving toward evening, the kind of sky that doesn't commit. Cole sat on the bench and thought about Grace, who was at Helen Kowalski's house right now, and who had probably started her homework by now, and who would be listening for the sound of his car at some point in the next hour or so. Not watching for it. Listening. She had learned early that you heard him before you saw him, and she had made this into a kind of game, counting the seconds between when she heard the car and when the door opened, which she had told him once was always between 12 and 15 seconds, never more, never less. She had then looked at him with the expression that meant she understood something about this without knowing what she understood, and he had said, "Yeah, that sounds about right," and left it there. He stood. He gathered his folded shirt and his kit. He walked toward the exit. Frank said from behind the security desk, "Cole." Not loud. Not an order. Just a name, the way you say a name when you're not sure what else to say but need to say something. Cole stopped. Didn't turn. "Frank, thank you." Cole stood still for a moment. Then, "It's just the job, Frank." He walked out into the afternoon. It wasn't. They both knew it wasn't. But there are things that are true and things that are useful to say, and occasionally the right thing to do is to let the useful thing stand without correcting it. He drove to Cicero, parked in front of the Kowalski house. Grace came out before he reached the porch. She always came out before he reached the porch, timing calibrated by the 12 to 15-second window she had measured. She hit him at full speed, arms around his waist, face pressed into his chest. He held her, smelled her hair, strawberry shampoo and something that might have been chalk. "Grace," her voice muffled by his shirt, "you smell like smoke." Cole. There was a fire at work. She pulled back and looked at him with her mother's eyes, direct brown taking inventory. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, sweetheart." She studied him for another second. Then, "Did you help people?" He considered this. "Yes." She nodded once, the nod of someone filing information under confirmed, and took his hand. "Helen made soup. She said you have to take some home." He said that was good of Helen. They went inside. He sat at Helen's kitchen table and let Grace show him her homework fractions, which she was approaching with the combination of competence and principled objection that she brought to most things she didn't want to like but was good at anyway. He helped her with the last 3 problems. He ate a bowl of soup standing at the counter because there wasn't space at the table without moving things, and he didn't feel like moving things. He thanked Helen, who waved this away in the manner of someone for whom being thanked is mildly offensive. He drove Grace home, made her bath, read 2 chapters of the book she was currently on. She was cycling through the Magic Treehouse series again in a new order, and she had decided that reading them differently this time was about something, though she hadn't decided what yet. He tucked her in. Standing in her doorway after she'd closed her eyes, he checked the lock on her window. Then the one in the bathroom. The kitchen. The front door, once then twice the second time, not because he doubted the first, but because he was made of habits that could not be entirely unbuilt, only redirected. He was not paranoid. He was careful in the way that men are careful when they have spent a long time in situations where careless people did not remain in situations for very long. He sat in the chair by the living room window. The street outside was quiet. A dog somewhere, a car passing slowly, the sound of someone's television 2 houses down. These were Sarah's sounds, the ones she'd called her favorites. Not silence, just ordinary life at low volume. He had hated them at first after. Hated how unchanged they were. He did not hate them anymore. They were just sounds. He had learned to take them as they were. His phone showed 1 missed call. Unknown number. The area code was one he recognized from a long time ago, from a context that no longer officially existed. He looked at it for a while. Then he set the phone face down on the arm of the chair and looked out the window instead. The man at the building entrance today. Silver-haired. That particular kind of posture. The weight of a debt waiting to come due. Cole had known in the abstract that this was eventually possible, that something from that part of his life would surface the way things surface, not in dramatic fashion, not announced, just present one day, in a form he would have to address. He had spent 3 years making himself small enough that there was very little surface area for the past to catch. It had mostly worked. He had become C. Merritt Maintenance Hargrove Capital Group badge number 14, the man who replaced the filters and went home at 5:30 and never worked overtime and never explained why. He had not regretted a single day of it. Not one. Whatever came next, that was still true. Whatever phone rang that he didn't answer, whatever silver-haired man confirmed whatever he had come to confirm, whatever name Frank Kowalski had said in the lobby of a building still trailing smoke into the October sky, none of it changed the calculation. Grace was asleep in the next room. He had been home at 5:30. The locks were checked. The mission remained exactly what it had always been. He closed his eyes and let the sound of the ordinary night do what it always did, remind him that this, too, was something worth protecting. Caroline Hargrove did not find out about the fire from the building's emergency notification system. She found out from her phone, which rang 4 times in 6 minutes while she was sitting in a client meeting on the 42nd floor of the Hargrove Midtown building 12 blocks north, and she answered the 4th call, because 4 calls in 6 minutes from the same number is a category of persistence that means something has changed. Richard Kane. Her COO had a specific quality to his voice when he was managing information he was not sure how to present. A flatness that was not calm but was performing calm with considerable effort. Caroline had learned to read it the way you learn to read anything that matters, not from a manual, from accumulation. 3 years of working beside a man watching his voice do what his face wouldn't. There's been a fire at the tower. 22nd floor. Electrical. A pause timed too precisely to be accidental. 3 employees were trapped. Caroline was already moving her chair back from the table. They're out. How? Another pause. The maintenance worker. Merritt. He went up while the building was evacuating and pulled them out. One of them, Park from IT, had a broken leg. Merritt carried him down 22 flights. The room was quiet. Her clients across the table had the decency to look at something other than her face while she absorbed this information, which she appreciated in the abstract and would not have time to acknowledge in the concrete. She said, "I'll call you back in 10 minutes," and ended the call. She sat for a moment with her phone face down on the table. The light through the north windows was the particular quality of late afternoon in October, the kind of light that falls at an angle and illuminates the dust in the air, makes the ordinary visible. She thought about the name she had used in front of 200 people 2 days ago, the tone she had used, the way the room had received it, with the specific silence of people who have collectively decided that what is happening is not their problem to address. The client across the table said carefully, "We can reschedule if—" "No." She turned back to the table. "We have 40 minutes of material left. We'll finish." She finished. She was not present for it in the way she was normally present. Normally she occupied meetings completely with the full attention of someone who understood that any moment of inattention had a cost she would pay somewhere downstream. Today she was operating on the layer of herself that ran meetings on competence alone, while the part that did the actual thinking worked a separate problem in a separate room. The separate problem was this: a man she had degraded in front of 200 people 4 days ago had 4 days later run into a burning building and carried one of her employees to safety. And she was experiencing something she was not accustomed to experiencing, which was the specific discomfort of knowing that the story she had told herself about a situation was wrong in a way that could not be patched or revised, but only discarded. She had not been wrong about many things. She had been wrong about this. The meeting ended at 6:40. She called Richard from the car. The structural damage was contained to the 22nd floor east section and partial water damage on 23 from the failed sprinkler zone. The system failure was pre-existing. There had been a work order filed that week about a potential electrical issue in the east wall of 22 filed by Merritt, routed to building engineering scheduled for inspection the following Monday. The fire had happened on Thursday. She listened to this with the patience of someone cataloging information that will be useful later and filed it accordingly. Then, what's the condition of the 3 employees? Shaw and Porter were treated and released at Northwestern Memorial. Ryan Mercer was in surgery for the femur. His condition was stable and the prognosis was good, which was a medical way of saying that he would recover and that this outcome had a specific name attached to it. She asked for Merritt's personnel file to be on her desk when she arrived. Then she asked for Margaret Stone from HR to remain in the building until she got there. Margaret had gone home. She came back. This was the kind of organization Caroline ran, Not because she demanded it, because she had built it with people who understood that events of consequence did not respect business hours and who had made their peace with that. The file was on her desk. She read it standing still in her coat because sitting would have implied a patience she did not currently have. 16 months of employment. Performance reviews that used words like thorough, reliable, self-directed. No disciplinary issues, no absences. A reference that had provided nothing and had said so in language that was polite and absolute in equal measure. And before Hargrove Capital, 9 years listed as independent contractor, no company, no supervisor, no contract details. Before that, nothing. A gap that wasn't a gap. Gaps implied something on either side. This was a wall. Margaret Stone came in at 7:15. She was 62 and had been in human resources longer than Caroline had been running companies, and she brought with her the accumulated authority of someone who has seen every variety of personnel situation and retained her composure through all of them. She had flagged the file 3 weeks ago with a notation that simply said, anomalous reference call, non-standard. She had not escalated it further because the anomaly presented no security concern, and the employee's performance was exceptional, and in the absence of a problem, there was no action to take. Caroline asked her to describe the reference call. Margaret described it: the flatness of the voice, the confirmation of employment dates, the precise non-answer to every follow-up question. The line, "I recommend you accept his file as submitted." Caroline listened. Then she said, "In 24 years of HR work, how many reference calls like that have you received?" Margaret said, "One, this one." Caroline thanked her and let her go. She sat behind her desk and looked out the window at the city below, which was doing what cities do in the evening, switching modes, the working population flowing out and the night population flowing in the light, changing from artificial white to the warmer registrations of restaurants and apartment windows and the particular amber of Chicago streetlights. She had 2 calls she needed to make. One was straightforward, one was not. She made the straightforward one first. Richard confirmed that Derek Walsh had submitted a resignation that afternoon, one sentence, the formulation of someone who wants to leave but cannot bring themselves to say why. She told Richard to hold the processing. Then she hung up and held the phone for a moment before making the second call. Arthur Cavanaugh had retired from federal consulting 4 years ago and now lived in Lake Forest and occasionally answered his phone. She had known him since childhood. He had been a colleague of her father's in a period when her father had occupied roles that were not described in any official biography. Arthur knew things the way certain people know things, not because they sought the information, but because they had spent their careers in the rooms where information lived. He picked up on the second ring. She told him what she knew: the file, the reference call, what she had witnessed in the lobby after the fire. She described it precisely because precision was the most respectful thing she could offer, and Arthur was the kind of person who received imprecision as a mild insult. He was quiet for a time that had weight to it. Not the pause of someone organizing a response, the pause of someone deciding what portion of the truth they are going to give. Victoria. He had called her that since she was 12, not Caroline. "I'm going to tell you something once, and I won't repeat it, and I need you to understand that by once, I mean once." She said she understood. "The person you're describing gave up things that people like you and me don't have words for because our lives have never required us to develop the vocabulary. He was promised one thing in return: not recognition, not compensation, just to be left alone." A pause. "He has a daughter." She said she knew. "Then you understand that everything he's done since he started mopping your floors is an act of will. Every day that he doesn't go back to what he was is a choice that costs him something. And what you said to him in that room 2 days ago—" Arthur stopped, started again. "Fix it, but fix it because it's the right thing to do, not because you found out who he was." The line went quiet. Then he said, "Good night, Victoria," and ended the call. She set the phone down. The office was dark, except for the desk lamp and the city light through the glass. She pulled Merritt's employee photo up on her laptop. Gray uniform, even expression eyes that looked directly at the camera with the specific quality of someone who has been looked at under far more consequential circumstances and has therefore made a permanent peace with being seen. She looked at the photo for a long time. At 11:58, a notification came through from HR processing. Derek Walsh had submitted his resignation paperwork for formal processing. She forwarded it back to Richard with one line, "Hold. I will handle personally." She sat in her dark office until well past midnight, writing something and deleting it and writing it again. She arrived at the tower the next morning at 7:30. The lobby still held the chemical aftermath of the previous day, the particular mixture of suppressed smoke and industrial cleaning product that takes 24 hours to fully clear. Cleanup crews were working the lower floors. The upper floors were operational, though they had the altered quality of spaces through which something significant has recently passed. Quieter, more deliberate, the people who had come in moving with the specific attention of those who have been reminded that ordinary days can reclassify without warning. She took the private elevator to the maintenance level. Cole Merritt was in the supply room adjacent to the equipment bay, working through an inventory shelf with the methodical attention he apparently brought to everything. He heard her before he saw her. She was certain of this, could tell from the quality of the stillness that settled over him in the half-second before he turned, the stillness of someone who processes incoming information before acknowledging it. He turned. He did not register surprise. She was beginning to understand that the absence of surprise on his face was not indifference. It was the practiced neutrality of someone for whom reacting to the unexpected had been at some point a luxury he could not afford, and who had therefore trained the reaction into a more controllable form. She said, "I know who you are." His expression did not change. "Not everything," she said. "Enough. Arthur Kavanaugh told me to leave you alone. I'm not going to do that." He looked at her with the directness she was becoming familiar with. Not hostile, not particularly warm. The look of someone waiting for the thing that is actually going to be said because the preliminary has been identified and set aside. She had prepared for this conversation. She had built a structure for it the way she built structures for every consequential conversation, knowing her opening, knowing her pivot points, knowing where she was willing to give ground and where she was not. Standing here in this basement supply room looking at this man, the structure dissolved. Not because she was nervous, because she recognized that whatever she delivered from memory would land as exactly that, and this particular moment required something that couldn't be prepared. "What I said to you in that room was wrong." She said it the way she said things when she meant them, without inflection that might suggest she was performing meaning. "Not because of what you went back to yesterday, not because Arthur told me what you are. It would have been wrong regardless." He said nothing. "I've been trying to figure out how to say this in a way that isn't about me." A pause. "I haven't entirely succeeded, but I want you to know that I understand the distinction between apologizing because I found out you were someone important and apologizing because I was wrong about something that had nothing to do with importance." Cole set down the container he'd been holding. He looked at her steadily. "Ms. Hargrove, are you here because you feel guilty? Or because you feel exposed?" It was the most precise question she had been asked in a long time. She felt the accuracy of it the way you feel the accuracy of a diagnosis that names the thing you've been working around. She said, "Both. I think both. And I think the honest answer to that question is the only thing that makes what I'm here for worth anything." Something shifted in his expression. Barely the difference between a door closed and a door closed but not locked. He said, "Come with me." He led her up the service stairwell to the ground floor, through the service entrance to the side of the building, out onto a narrow strip of concrete between the building's exterior and the alley fence. It was 8 in the morning in October, and the cold had the particular authority of a season that has arrived and intends to stay. He sat on a low concrete barrier and looked at the fence and waited. She sat beside him. The suit she was wearing had cost $3,800 and was not designed for concrete barriers in service alleys. She sat on it anyway. He spoke first, which she hadn't expected. "My wife used to have this thing she did. When something bothered her, not a problem she could solve, just something sitting wrong in the world, she'd find the most ordinary task she could think of and do it until the thing sitting wrong felt smaller." He was looking at the fence. Dishes, folding laundry, weeding the garden in a way that probably damaged more than it helped. A pause. "When she died, I understood for the first time why a person might choose a simple job, not because they lack ambition, because simplicity is a kind of armor." Caroline was very still. Grace was 4. She stopped talking for 4 months. He said it plainly, the way you say things that have been lived with long enough to lose their acute edge without losing their weight. 4 months of a little girl who would not make a sound except the functional ones. During that time I sat on the floor of her room every night. I didn't talk either. I just stayed. He turned to look at Caroline for the first time since they'd sat down. There were people who wanted me to come back. Good people with what they believed were legitimate arguments. They were right about the arguments. They were wrong about the arithmetic. Caroline asked the question she had been building toward for 2 days. What's the arithmetic? The world has a surplus of men who can do what I did. It has exactly one person who is Grace's father. He held her gaze with the specific patience of someone who is not trying to convince her of something, who is simply presenting a fact and letting it be a fact. So I picked up a mop. She looked away first, not because she was intimidated, because some things require a moment of not being looked at while you absorb them. "What you said to me in front of your people," Cole continued, "didn't land the way you think it did. Not because I'm particularly thick-skinned, because the person standing in front of you in that room already knew who he was and what he'd done and what he was living for. You can't take that from someone with a sentence. You can't give it back to them either. It was already there." The right words, when they come, don't always arrive in the order you expect. She had been many things in her professional life: persuasive, decisive, controlled, effective. She had not often been correct in the specific way this man had just been correct about her. The kind of correct that doesn't leave you room to argue without making things worse. "There's a young analyst on 27, she said. "Derek Walsh. He submitted his resignation yesterday." Cole looked at her. He was the one who spilled the coffee. A beat. "I know. He's 27 years old. He watched me do what I did, and he learned that day that silence is the safest thing in that room. That's not a thing I can let stand." Cole was quiet for a moment. Then, "What are you proposing?" She laid it out. A meeting on Friday, the same people, the same room. A public accounting, not a memo, not a corporate communication herself, standing in front of 200 people and saying the thing she had built her entire professional identity on never having to say. She would name Derek. She would name Cole with his consent. She would make it cost something because that was the only version that meant anything. Cole listened to this. His expression during it was the expression of someone running calibrations, checking what's being offered against what's actually available. And the analyst. "I'll talk to him before Friday, privately. That part's not for the room." Then you understand the difference between the apology that's for the 200 people and the apology that's for him. She said, "I'm learning it." He looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite approval and was not quite skepticism, a waiting quality, as if the verdict was still in progress. "There's one more thing." She waited. "You do this without me in the room." She frowned. "You're the person If I'm there, the story becomes about me. About what I did in that building, about whatever Whitfield told you, about every piece of the picture that makes this feel resolved because the person you wronged turned out to be someone extraordinary." He shook his head once. "That's not what needs to happen in that room. What needs to happen is your people watching you reckon with what you did regardless of who was holding the mop. The version of the story where I'm sitting in the back row is the easy version. It lets everyone off the hook." The precision of this struck her with the specific force of being outthought by someone she had not expected to be outthought by, which was, she was beginning to understand the experience of underestimating Cole Merritt in any dimension. She said, That might be the most strategically sophisticated thing anyone has said to me this year. He almost smiled. Not quite. The almost was enough. She stood. He stood. The alley around them was the ordinary mess of urban infrastructure dumpsters, pipes, the back ends of things designed to be invisible. She extended her hand. He looked at it for a moment, then took it. The handshake was brief, firm, the kind that means something has been agreed to by people who mean what they agree to. She turned to go, then stopped. One more thing. From me. He waited. I'd like to offer you a different role. Not today. After Friday. She said the title. He didn't react to it. You've been in this building for 16 months. You know it better than any security consultant I've ever paid to tell me things about it. You know the people in it, the systems, the gaps. She paused. Think about whether it interests you. Cole said, I'll think about it. It was not yes. It was not dismissal. It was the answer of someone who makes decisions after they've made them, not during the making. She found Derek Walsh at his desk on 27 at 2 in the afternoon. He was working or performing the motions of working, which was a different thing, the kind of productive-looking behavior that people engage in when the interior weather is too difficult to address directly. His desk had the half-cleared quality of someone who has started making decisions about what to take when they leave and then stopped leaving the decision visible. She pulled a chair from the empty desk beside his, sat down with no table between them, no physical representation of their respective positions in the organization's hierarchy. He looked at her with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a consequence and is now experiencing the specific anxiety of that consequence arriving. She said, I owe you an apology. He said nothing, which was the reaction of someone who has been misled before by the opening of conversations that turned out to be about something other than what they announced. 4 days ago, I stood in a room full of people and allowed a mistake you made, an accident, to be treated as someone else's failure. That someone else cleaned it up without saying a word. He didn't look at you once during the whole thing, and I think he did that on purpose because he understood something I didn't, that you were 27 years old in a room where no one was going to protect you, and the least he could do was not make it worse. She paused. I made it considerably worse. Derek's jaw was tight. His hands were flat on the desk in the posture of someone who has decided to be very still. The fear you felt in that room, the fear that made silence the only real option, I built that. Not that day. Over time, in 100 smaller moments before that one. That's not a thing I can undo by having this conversation. But I can tell you clearly that what I did was wrong, and that it came out of something in me, not something in you. He looked up. His eyes were the eyes of someone who has been holding a weight in a fixed position for 4 days and is beginning to understand that they are allowed to set it down. I wanted to say something. His voice was careful, each word placed. I stood there and I thought, say it. Say it was you. And I looked at your face and I couldn't. A pause. And then he just knelt down and started cleaning. And he didn't look at me. Not once. And I've been thinking about that for 4 days. She said, he knew. He saw your hands before it happened. Derek closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, something had changed in them, not resolved, but moved like a stone that has been shifted from a position it has occupied long enough to leave a mark in the ground beneath it. He protected you, she said. That's what he is. That's who he is. And I stood in front of him and used him as an object lesson in failure. She let the sentence be what it was without softening it. I'm going to stand in front of those same people on Friday and account for what I did. I'm going to name you. I'm going to say you spilled the coffee and that you stayed silent because I had made silence the only safe choice in that room, and I'm going to ask you to be there not to be embarrassed, but so that the people in that room see you hold your head up in it. Derek was very still for a long moment. Then, is he going to be there, Merritt? No. He absorbed this. Why not? She thought about the alley that morning, the way Cole had explained it with the patience of someone who had already worked out why a simpler version would be worse. Because the story needs to be about what happened in that room, not about who he turned out to be. If he's there, everyone gets to feel resolved because the ending is neat. The point isn't the ending. The point is the middle, what happened in that room and why we all let it happen. Derek looked at his desk, at the half-cleared surface, at the space where a decision had been partially made and suspended. He reached out and took a framed photo that had been leaning against the partition, a family photo, parents and a younger sibling, a summer somewhere with water in the background, and set it back in its place upright facing him. He said, "I'll be there." Raymond Hargrove was 72 years old and had the kind of influence that didn't need a title to function. He had served on the Senate Intelligence Committee for 11 years, had been a quiet architect of several programs that would not be discussed in any committee hearing at any point in the foreseeable future, and had been sitting on the advisory board of Hargrove Capital since Caroline's husband died because he had loved Thomas and because he believed that what Charles Lancaster had built deserved to survive the loss of Charles Lancaster. He called Caroline on Thursday morning, which was the day before the meeting, and he did not begin with pleasantries. "You've been talking to Arthur." She said she had. Arthur has more discretion than most people in his position. The fact that he told you anything means he trusts your judgment. A pause. "I'm less certain than Arthur." She waited. "The file I'm referring to has been a concern for approximately 8 months. His voice had the economy of someone who has spent decades saying only as much as is necessary. "There is a man named Harold Vance who held private contracts with a program that officially does not exist. He has documents from that program that he has been using carefully, slowly, with the particular patience of someone who understands that the value of a threat is in its potential, not its execution." Another pause. "Those documents contain names." She understood before he finished. Merritt's name. His wife's name. His daughter's name, though she was not named Grace at the time of the document. He stopped. "Let that settle. I am handling the Vance situation. I want you to know that. It is being handled through channels that are appropriate to it, and it will be resolved within a reasonable period of time. I am telling you this so that you understand the full context of what you have engaged with by engaging with this man." She said, "You've known he was in my building." "For 8 months, yes." "And you left him there." "He chose to be there. He made a choice 3 years ago about the life he wanted to live. My role in that choice was to honor it, not to manage it." She thought about Cole in the alley that morning, the simplicity of what he had said about the arithmetic, the completeness of it. He knows about the Vance situation. I will be speaking with him directly. He is owed that conversation by me, not by you. A beat. What I'm asking you to do, Caroline, is to continue doing exactly what you appear to be doing, which is treating a man as a man with what he deserves and without curiosity about what he was. The rest is not your concern. She said, "Understood." Raymond said, "Your father would have handled this well. I believe you will also." He said it the way people say things they mean but rarely say, not as a compliment, as an observation. He ended the call. She sat for a moment after thinking about the word handled, about what it meant in the context of a situation that had no clean resolution, only a series of choices about what to honor and what to set aside, about a man in a basement supply room who had chosen the smallest possible life and had made that choice into something large enough to carry meaning. She thought about Grace, whom she had not met, and about what it meant to be 7 years old and to write, "Home is where Dad is" in crayon on construction paper, and mean it with the absolute certainty that only children carry without knowing it is absolute. She went back to her desk. She opened the document she had been revising since midnight. She read what she had written. She deleted the final paragraph, which had been about outcomes and the future of the organization, because she understood now that the speech could not end with a statement about what the organization would do. It had to end with what she had done and no further. The accounting had to be complete in itself without the comfort of an organizational promise attached to the back of it. She wrote a new final line, read it 3 times, left it. Friday arrived the way Fridays arrive, when you have been moving toward something all week too quickly and not quickly enough. The building filled in the usual way by 9, though some of the usual rhythms were off. The floors that had been emptied by the fire on Thursday were still quieter than normal. The people who had been evacuated moved with the slightly heightened attention of those who have recently been reminded of something. Conference room 38 filled by 8:55, 200 people in the same chairs they had occupied 9 days ago. Some of them already knew why they were there. The information had moved through the organization in the way information moves through organizations when no one is officially releasing it imperfectly, incompletely, but in the right direction. Others were speculating. The room had the particular energy of a space waiting for something it has not yet been told to expect. At 9, Caroline walked in. No slides, no materials, no preliminary remarks from an assistant or a framing statement from communications. She walked to the position she had occupied 9 days ago, and she stood there, and she looked out at 200 faces, and she began. 9 days ago I stood in this room and I degraded a member of this organization's maintenance staff in front of all of you. His name is Cole Merritt. He was cleaning a coffee spill that he had nothing to do with. I told him in front of every one of you that the condition of a floor was worth more than his hourly wage. I used him to make a point about standards in a way that had nothing to do with standards and everything to do with what it feels like to have power over someone and to use it. The room had gone the specific quality of quiet that is not absence of sound. Someone shifted a phone buzzed on silent and was immediately silenced, but was instead the active quality of 200 people choosing not to make any sound because what is being said requires their full attention. 4 days later, that same man went back into a building that was on fire while 200 of us walked out of it. He carried Ryan Mercer, who is recovering from a broken femur at Northwestern Memorial, down 22 flights of stairs. He gave the paramedics a precise medical assessment of Ryan's condition and then stepped back before anyone could ask his name. She stopped. Not for effect, because the sentence after required a precision she did not want to compromise with momentum. I was wrong. I was cruel. I treated a human being as an instrument of a point I wanted to make, and I did it because I had the authority to do it, and no one in this room stopped me. She let that sit, including me. She looked at the 5th row. Derek Walsh, stand up. Derek stood. His face was controlled in the way that someone's face is controlled when they have made a deliberate decision to hold it together in a public setting and are executing that decision one breath at a time. Derek spilled the coffee. He's 27 years old, and he's been with this organization for 8 months, and he stood in this room and watched me do what I did and said nothing because I had built a culture in which saying something carried a cost he couldn't afford to pay. That is my failure, not his. She held his gaze for a moment. He submitted his resignation this week. He withdrew it. I am grateful for that, because what this organization needs is people who, having seen what can happen in this room, choose to stay and make it different. Derek sat down. The woman beside him put her hand briefly on his arm. I am not standing here to manage a situation. I am standing here because what happened in this room 9 days ago was wrong, and the only honest response to something wrong is to name it without qualifiers. She looked at the room as a whole, not at faces, at the space they all occupied together, the shared geography of an organization that had watched something happen and not stopped it. If you see something like this happen again to anyone by anyone in any room in this building, I expect you to speak. Not because it is policy, because it is right, and because the cost of silence, as every one of you now knows, falls somewhere other than on the person who chose to be silent. She looked at the room for one more second. That's all. She walked out. No applause followed her. What followed her was something less comfortable and more durable, the sound of 200 people sitting with something they had been given and would have to decide what to do with. Cole was in the parking garage on B1 when his phone buzzed. A text from Frank Doan. Room is still sitting there. Then after a pause of about 40 seconds, a second text, "You should have been there." Cole read both texts, put the phone in his pocket, finished checking the tire pressure on the maintenance van, which was 2 pounds low on the rear left, and had been for a week because no one else had noticed. He had not been there. He had been in B1 checking the maintenance van because the maintenance van was his job, and because the accounting that had just happened in that room was not his, and because he had understood since the conversation in the alley that his presence would have been a resolution to something that didn't need to resolve cleanly. It needed to remain difficult. It needed to cost the room something that wouldn't be absorbed and forgotten by the end of the day. He thought about Derek Walsh, 27 years old, standing up in a room of 200 people. He thought about what it takes to stand up in a room of 200 people when you are 27 and you have recently learned the cost of visibility. He thought that kid is going to be fine. He finished with the van, logged the pressure reading in the maintenance form, returned the gauge to its hook in the supply area, clocked out at 5:28, drove to Cicero. Grace was on the porch. She had her homework spread across the top step in a configuration that suggested she had started working and then become interested in something else, possibly the 2 sparrows arguing in the oak at the end of the yard. When she saw his car, she gathered the papers with the focused efficiency of someone restoring plausible homework activity. He parked and walked up the path, and she watched him come with her mother's eyes and her own expression, which had been entirely her own from the beginning and would always be. He sat beside her on the top step. She showed him the homework. They worked through the last 2 problems together, Grace explaining her method with the authority of someone who has decided that understanding the process is a reasonable exchange for not having to do as many steps. He said she was right. She said she knew. They went inside. He made dinner. He read to her. He tucked her in and checked the locks: front door, back door, kitchen window, bathroom window, her window last, and most carefully, the way he had done every night for 3 years and would continue to do, because there are habits that keep people alive that don't have an off switch, only a volume that gets turned down over time. He sat by the window, and the city did its nighttime things around him. He thought about the conversation he was going to have with Frank tomorrow morning about the security protocols on the B1 level, which had 3 camera blind spots that no one who hadn't spent 16 months watching the building from every angle would have identified. He thought about the work order he needed to file on the east stairwell door between floors 20 and 21, which was developing a hinge issue that would eventually create an emergency exit problem. He thought about Ryan Mercer, who had sent an email from his hospital room that afternoon. The email said, "I don't know what to say. Thank you doesn't feel like the right size. But thank you." Cole had read the email twice. He had not yet replied. He would when he found the right words, which he understood were not going to be large ones. He had spent a long time in a life where the things that mattered had no words attached to them, because attaching words made them visible, and visible things could be used against you. He had been in the process for 3 years of learning that a different kind of life operated on different rules. That in this life the things that mattered could be named, that naming them didn't diminish them, that a 7-year-old who said home is where Dad is and meant it was doing something more important than most of the things that had ever had his name on them in any classified document. He thought about Caroline Hargrove in the alley, the way she had sat on the concrete barrier in a $3,800 suit without making any calculation about the suit. The way she had said, "I'm learning it," in response to something he'd said about the difference between 2 kinds of apology, and the way that answer had been more honest than agreement would have been. He thought about the phone call he was going to have with Raymond Hargrove. He had been avoiding it not because he was afraid of it, because he understood that the call would move something that had been in suspension, and things in suspension can be managed more easily than things in motion. Raymond had kept his distance for 8 months. That the distance had ended was information. He would sit with that information for another day or 2 before deciding what to do with it. Grace's breathing through the cracked door was the slow and even breathing of a child in deep sleep. He counted the rhythm the way he had counted things in rooms far darker than this one. It was steady. Everything for this moment was steady. Tomorrow there would be the conversation with Frank, and the work order, and possibly a different conversation than the one he'd been having with himself about whether a different role in a building he already knew, for people he was beginning to trust, was something a man in his particular situation could allow himself to want. He didn't know yet. He was holding the question the way he held most questions that mattered, not forcing an answer, letting it arrive when it was ready. Outside, Chicago continued. The particular sounds of the city at 10:30 on a Friday in October, which were different from the sounds at 6:45 on a Tuesday morning, and different again from the sounds at 3 in the afternoon on a day when a building fills with smoke and people have to decide in real time what they're going to do. All of it the same city, all of it different depending on what you brought to the listening. Cole closed his eyes. He let the sounds be what they were. Raymond Hargrove called on Saturday morning at 8:47. Cole was in the kitchen making oatmeal when the phone rang, not the unknown number from before Raymond's direct line, which Cole had stored in his contacts 3 years ago under a name that was not Raymond's name, a habit from a time when the people who called him were not people whose names you wanted visible on a screen. He looked at the entry, let it ring twice, then answered. Raymond said, "I think it's time we talked in person." Cole said, "I know." A pause. Then Raymond, with the dry precision of someone who has spent decades in rooms where directness is either a weapon or a courtesy depending on who's using it. "You always did know things before they needed to be said." That was either impressive or maddening depending on the day. Cole said, "Which day is today?" "Somewhere in between. I'll come to you. This afternoon if that works." It worked. Cole gave him the address which Raymond already had because Raymond was the kind of person who had addresses before he asked for them. They agreed on 2 o'clock. Cole hung up and stood at the stove and watched the oatmeal until it was done, then served it to Grace with the brown sugar without being asked, because she always wanted the brown sugar and he had stopped asking whether she wanted it sometime in the first year. Grace ate with the focused pleasure of someone who takes breakfast seriously. She had a book open beside her bowl, which was technically against the table rules, but Cole had decided early in the parenting enterprise that certain rules needed to be applied with judgment about which battles mattered, and Grace reading at breakfast was not one of the battles that mattered. She was rereading the same Magic Treehouse installment she had read twice already this cycle, the one about the Revolutionary War. And she had told him last week that it was different every time, because she was different every time she read it, which was the kind of observation that made him understand, with a periodic and reliable force, that whatever he had done right in the last 3 years had produced this particular person, and that was an outcome worth any cost. He told her a friend was coming over at 2. She asked what kind of friend. He said an old one which she received with the equanimity of a child accustomed to her father's economy with personal information. She said she would be at Lily Patterson's house by then anyway because they were working on a science project. He said that worked. She looked at him over her book with a brief expression of assessment and then returned to the page, which was the closest she got to saying everything seemed fine to her. Raymond arrived at 1:58. He drove himself, which Cole noted, no driver, no security, a car that was nice but not conspicuous, a Lincoln that could belong to any successful man in his early 70s who had decided that comfort mattered more than statement. He came up the porch steps with the careful deliberateness of someone whose knees have opinions and who has accepted this, and Cole held the door and they went inside. Raymond looked at the living room with the look of a man cataloging a space the habit of a lifetime. Involuntary the way Cole's eyes had swept the room before Raymond knocked. He noted the drawing on the refrigerator visible through the kitchen doorway. He noted the shoe rack by the door with 1 adult pair and 1 child pair. The child pair with Velcro instead of laces positioned with the automatic precision of a parent who has replaced laces with Velcro to save 90 seconds in the morning and considers this a reasonable optimization. He noted the quality of the ordinary in the room, which was the quality of a life organized around something other than its own appearance. They sat in the living room. Cole made coffee because it was something to do with his hands, and because offering coffee was the gesture that this kind of conversation required at its opening before the conversation became what it actually was. Raymond said, "The Vance situation has been resolved." Cole said, "I know that too." Raymond looked at him over the rim of his cup. "You have sources I'm not aware of." "I have a sense of when things are done. It's been quiet for 4 days in a way that has a different texture than it had the week before." Cole held his own cup with both hands the way he held cups when he was not thinking about how he was holding them. "When did you first know he was a problem?" 14 months ago. He made a preliminary approach to a lobbying firm with ties to 3 members of the current Defense Appropriations Subcommittee. The firm flagged it through appropriate channels. I became aware of it because of what was in the documents he was offering. Raymond set his cup on the side table with the care of someone who respects surfaces. "I chose not to tell you because telling you would have required you to make a decision about whether to respond, and I didn't want to put that decision in front of you unless I had no other option." Cole said, "That was your call to make." "Yes. I would have made the same one." Raymond looked at him steadily. There was something in the look that was not exactly apology and was not exactly gratitude. It was the expression of a man who has done a cost-benefit calculation and arrived at a number he can defend but cannot entirely be comfortable with. "The documents have been retrieved and destroyed. Vance has entered into an arrangement that removes him from any relevant sphere of activity for the foreseeable future. The people who needed to know the arrangement was made have been informed." Cole received this information the way he received most consequential information, without visible reaction, processing it in the interior space where he had always processed things that required processing. He thought about the name Grace at the bottom of a document he had never seen. He thought about a man he also had never seen sitting somewhere with that document running calculations about its value. He thought about what he would have done if Raymond had told him 14 months ago instead of this morning, and he understood that Raymond's calculation had been correct. Knowing would have required action. Action would have required becoming at least partially what he had spent 3 years not being. "Thank you," Cole said. He said it the way he said things he meant without inflection that dressed the meaning up. "For handling it the way you handled it." Raymond nodded once. Then he said, "I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to answer it the same way." Cole waited. "Are you well?" It was not a question about his physical condition. They both understood what it was, a question about the larger category of wellness that encompasses whether a person is intact in the ways that matter, whether the architecture of a life holds weight without developing fractures invisible from the outside. Cole thought about it. Not performing consideration, actually considering, because the question deserved it, and Raymond would know the difference. "Better than I was," he said, "which is different from well, but it's the direction." Raymond said, "That's an honest answer. It's the only kind I have left." Raymond looked at the kitchen doorway again, at the drawing visible on the refrigerator. "She's 7? 7.5. She counts the half." A small shift in Raymond's expression that was the closest the man came to warmth in the presence of a topic that moved him. Thomas was like that, counted the halves until he was 12. He said it with the ease of someone who has made peace with grief by allowing it to live in ordinary reference rather than protected categories. The best thing Charles did building what he built. The best thing Caroline has done is not letting it become something other than what he intended. Cole said, "She's different than I expected." Raymond said, "She's different than most people expect. That's been both her advantage and her problem." He picked up his cup again. "She told me about your conversation in the alley. She relayed it with more accuracy than I anticipated, including the parts that didn't reflect well on her initial motivations." A pause. "She's going to ask you to take the security position." "She already has." "What are you going to tell her?" Cole looked at the window. The oak in the front yard had gone the deep gold of late October, most of the leaves still on the branches, but the color committed, the green gone, the tree fully arrived at what it was going to be for this season. "I'm going to tell her yes," he said. "I've been telling myself I'm still deciding, but I decided 3 days ago." Raymond said, "What decided it?" "The blind spots." Cole said it with the directness of someone naming a concrete thing. There are 3 camera blind spots on the B1 level, 2 compromised emergency exits on the floors between 20 and 30, a gap in the badge scanning protocol at the service entrance on the east side that's been there for at least 16 months and probably longer. I know about all of them because I've been watching this building from every angle for over a year, and no one has asked me what I see. He looked at Raymond. A person who knows something that would make people safer and doesn't say it because he's decided that staying small is more important than being useful. That's not the same as choosing simplicity. That's just waste. Raymond was quiet for a moment. Then, your wife would have said something like that. Cole looked at him. Raymond had known Sarah not well, but through the peripheral overlap of the world, Cole had inhabited the way people in certain closed circles know the families of the people they work with. Yeah, Cole said. She would have. She was right about most things. Raymond stood with the deliberate care of his knees. So are you. They shook hands at the door. Raymond went down the porch steps with the same deliberateness, got into the Lincoln, and drove away. Cole stood in the doorway for a moment after the car turned the corner, looking at the street in the particular way you look at something after a significant thing has happened in its vicinity, as if the ordinary geography has been changed by what occurred there. He called Caroline on Monday morning at 7:15 before he left for work. She answered on the first ring, which told him she was already at her desk, which told him that certain things about her were consistent regardless of circumstance. He said he would take the position. She said she would have the paperwork drafted and the announcement ready for internal communication by end of day. He said the announcement could wait until he'd had a chance to speak with Frank personally. She said that was reasonable. He said there were several building security issues he would want to address in the first 2 weeks. She said she would give him the budget and the authority and would expect a report within 30 days, but that the report was for her information and not a prerequisite for action. He said he understood. She said, "One more thing." He waited. "What you said in the alley, about knowing who you are and what you're living for, and how no one can take that from you with words." She paused. "I've been thinking about that since Friday, about whether I know the same thing about myself." Cole said, "That's a more useful question than most people get around to asking." She said, "Do you have an answer for yourself?" He thought about Grace counting the halves, about the oatmeal with the brown sugar, about the locks checked in order every night front to back, the last one her window, the checking itself an act of love so habitual it had become indistinguishable from breathing. "Yeah," he said, "I have an answer." She said, "I'm working on mine." He said, "That's the right place to be." He told Frank that morning in the security office on the ground floor before the building filled. Frank heard it with the stillness he brought to most significant information, and then said, "You know, I've known for 11 months that you were overqualified to be replacing my light bulbs." Cole said, "I know you know." Frank said, "I also know why you did it." "Yeah." Frank extended his hand. The handshake had the quality of 2 men who have been standing on the same side of something for a long time without formally acknowledging it, now formally acknowledging it. Frank said, "The East Service entrance badge gap. I flagged it in a report 8 months ago. No one acted on it." Cole said, "I know. I read all your reports." Frank looked at him. "You read my security reports." "I read everything I could access. You write good reports, specific, clear, action-oriented. They were being routed to building operations and sitting in a queue." He paused. "That's going to change." Frank said, "I was going to mention the camera blind spots on B1. Cole said, "I know about those too." Frank looked at him for a long moment. Then he sat back in his chair with the expression of someone who has been doing a job under conditions of partial resource and has just been told the conditions are about to change. It was not a loud expression. It was the expression of a man who has maintained something for a long time against friction and has just had the friction removed, and who is feeling the absence of it before he knows what to do with the absence. He said, "Tell me where you want to start." The first team meeting was on Wednesday. Cole stood in the basement break room in front of 14 security staff, former law enforcement, former military. Two younger men who had gotten into security because the pay was reasonable and the hours were structured, all of them waiting to take the measure of the man who had been pushing a maintenance cart past their desk for 16 months and was now their director. He had thought about what he was going to say, and he had thought about it the way he thought about all things that required precision, by taking out anything that wasn't necessary until what remained was exactly what was needed and nothing more. My name is Cole Merritt. Some of you know me as the janitor. That's accurate. I was also the janitor and I was good at it, and the reason I was good at it is that I paid attention. Every floor of this building, every stairwell, every corridor, every door and hinge and camera angle, I know this building from the inside in a way that no security consultant you've ever paid for a report has known it, because consultants spend 3 days and leave, and I spent 16 months and stayed. He looked around the room. What I'm going to do in the next 30 days is teach you what I know, not from a manual, from walking it with you. Garcia, one of the younger men, said, "What's your background?" "Military law enforcement." Cole said, "I've done work that's relevant. I'd rather show you what I know than explain where I learned it. Does that work for everyone?" No one objected. Frank, standing near the back, had the expression of a man who has been patient for a long time and is now watching that patience return something. Cole spent the next hour walking them through the building's vulnerabilities in the specific language of someone who has cataloged them through direct observation rather than theoretical assessment. The B1 camera blind spots 3 of them, 2 at angles that could be corrected by repositioning existing cameras, and 1 that required a new installation. The service entrance badge gap, which could be addressed with a protocol change that cost nothing. The emergency exits between floors 20 and 30 that opened inward rather than outward, a fire code issue that had not been flagged because the inspection schedule covered every other floor and assumed uniformity. The radio dead zones in the east stairwell between 14 and 17, which meant that the last fire, the most recent, most concrete demonstration that dead zones had consequences, had involved a 17-minute gap in communication between the security desk and the floor. The room listened with the particular attention of people who are receiving information that is immediately useful information that makes the job they have been doing more possible. There is a specific quality to that kind of listening. It has no performance in it, no social management, just the concentrated intake of people who recognize that what they're hearing is going to change how they work. After the hour, Garcia came to Cole as the others were leaving. He said, "The guy who carried Ryan Mercer down 22 floors. That was you." Cole said, "Yeah." Garcia looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Okay," with the inflection of someone who has just placed a piece of information in the correct category, and left. The building changed in small ways over the following weeks. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, small ways the kind that only become visible in aggregate. The security team began to know the names of the people whose badges they processed each morning. Not all of them, there were too many for complete coverage, but consistently across the floors, they managed building the kind of mutual recognition that makes a space feel like a place rather than a system. A senior vice president on the 36th floor, who had navigated his building for 4 years, making no eye contact with the security desk, stopped one morning and said his name was Patterson, and asked the guard on duty if the new protocols had changed anything about his access. The guard, whose name was Torres, said they hadn't, and they spent 3 minutes talking about the exit procedure changes on 20 through 30. Patterson went up in the elevator with the slightly altered quality of a man who has just been reminded that the building he works in is occupied by people rather than functions. Derek Walsh stopped by Cole's office on a Thursday in November. The office was a repurposed storage room on the 2nd floor that Cole had furnished with a desk, 2 chairs, and nothing decorative except a drawing Grace had made the week he started the job. 2 figures again, one tall and one small, but this time the tall figure was wearing what might have been a badge, and the small figure had her hands raised in the way she raised them when something delighted her. And at the bottom, "My dad, the director." He had taped it to the desk surface under the clear protective cover rather than the wall because it should be the thing he looked at, not the thing behind him. Derek knocked on the open door and came in with the ease of someone who has been moving through the world more easily than he had been, which was visible in the specific way. Ease is visible, not in anything he said or did, but in the quality of his movement, the uprightness of it, the absence of the particular self-containment that people adopt when they are managing something they can't set down. He said, "I wanted to say thank you, directly, not through an email." Cole said, "You don't owe me a thank you." Derek said, "I know. I'm giving it anyway." He sat down in the second chair without being asked, which Cole noted as evidence of the change. The version of Derek Walsh who had stood at the edge of a room holding a coffee cup with white knuckles would have remained standing. "What you did in that meeting not being there, I've thought about that a lot. Why it mattered that you weren't there." And Cole said, and Derek said, "Because if you'd been there I could have looked at you instead of at myself. And the looking at myself was the part that was necessary." Cole looked at him steadily. "You're going to be good at whatever you do. I don't say that to be kind. I say it because I've watched how you've moved through this building for the last month, and I can see the difference between someone who had an experience that broke them and someone who had an experience that told them something true about themselves." Derek was quiet for a moment. Then, "Can I ask you something personal?" Cole waited. "The things people say about you, about who you were before, is any of it true?" Cole had thought about how he would answer this question if it arrived because he had understood that in a building full of people who paid attention, it would eventually arrive. He had thought about it the way he thought about most questions with no clean answer, by looking for the formulation that was honest without being a door into territory he had decided not to open. "I've cleaned up messes," he said. "Some of them were coffee, some were bigger. The skills transfer." Derek looked at him, received this, accepted it. He stood and said, "The exit protocol change on 25. Someone propped the stairwell door open this morning with a fire extinguisher stand." Cole said, "I know. Torres flagged it at 7:40. It's been addressed." Derek said, "Of course it has." He left with the expression of someone who has gotten a satisfying confirmation of something they suspected. The winter concert at Grace's school was on a Tuesday in December. Cole left work at 4:30 an hour early, which he told Frank was a family commitment, and which Frank received with the nod of a man who has never once in 16 months seen Cole leave early for any reason and understands without discussion that the reason is sufficient. He drove to Cicero, changed out of his work clothes, and arrived at the school gymnasium at 5:55, which was 5 minutes before the doors opened because he was always early to things that mattered, and this mattered more than most. He sat in the third row, the gymnasium filled around him, parents with phones already out, grandparents moving slowly to the better positioned seats that grandparents have learned to identify and claim, younger siblings restless at the edges, the organized noise of families converging on a shared event. The woman who sat beside Cole glanced at his hands, the calluses, the specific roughness of them, and made a small unconscious adjustment in her posture that was the posture adjustment people make when they have categorized someone and arranged themselves accordingly. Cole did not notice or noticed and did not care which amounted to the same outcome. The lights went down. Children filed onto the risers in the specific order that represented weeks of rehearsal visible only in its result. Grace was in the second row, fourth from the left. She was wearing the white blouse Cole had ironed that morning with the focused imprecision of someone who was doing his best with a task for which he had no particular gift, and a green skirt she had chosen herself because green was her current definitive favorite, in the way that children have definitive favorites that are absolute until they are replaced by the next definitive favorite. She found him in the third row before the music started. Her eyes swept the audience with a quick, systematic efficiency that was, he had noticed more than once, a version of the same sweep he used when entering unfamiliar spaces, which meant he had given her something he hadn't intended to give her, and felt about this an uncomplicated mixture of concern and pride. She found him. She gave him the look that served as their signal. Eyebrows raised slightly. The gesture of a question answered, and he gave her the small nod that served as the answer, and she turned back to the front. They sang 3 pieces. The first was a traditional holiday song performed with the committed earnestness of children who have practiced it until the earnestness is genuine. The second was something slower minor key about finding your way home in winter, which Grace had sung to him 3 times in the apartment while he was washing dishes, and which sounded different with a full choir around it, fuller and more serious. The third piece had a solo. The solo went to a girl in the front row with a large voice and the confidence of someone who has been told they have a large voice since they were 4. Grace had mentioned this girl Mackenzie with the careful tone of someone who has decided to be fair about something that is not entirely fair to them. Cole watched Grace during the solo. She sang her supporting part with the particular quality of someone doing the job that is theirs to do without looking sideways at the job that belongs to someone else. And something about watching this, the completeness of her attention to her own task, made the back of his throat tighten with the specific pressure of feelings that arrive when you see a person you love being exactly who they are without apology or performance. After the concert in the parking lot with Grace's hand in his and her breath making small clouds in the December air, she said, "I didn't get the solo." He said, "I know." She said, "Mackenzie always gets the solo." He said, "Mackenzie has a big voice." She said, "I have a good voice." He said, "You have a great voice, and you sang your part perfectly, which is what you were supposed to do." He looked down at her. The best musicians in any group are the ones who know their part and play it completely. The solos happen because of everyone else doing their job first. Grace considered this with the evaluative attention she brought to things she was deciding whether to accept. Then, "That's a reasonable point." He said, "Thank you." She said, "It would be more reasonable if I had the solo." He laughed. The kind of laugh that comes from a place that has been gradually reopening over the course of 3 years, the place where the part of him that was just a person, not a function or a history or a set of capabilities, still lived. They got ice cream because Grace's position on ice cream in cold weather was that winter was an irrelevant variable. She got strawberry with rainbow sprinkles. He got black coffee flavor because it was the only kind that tasted like the coffee it was supposed to be. They sat at the small table by the window, the same shop Sarah had brought Grace to on Saturday mornings, a choice Grace had made without comment when he'd asked where she wanted to go, a choice he had received without comment because some things are honored through continuation. Grace ate with the focused pleasure of someone engaged in a serious sensory enterprise. Cole drank his coffee ice cream and watched the street outside, a couple arguing gently about directions, a man walking a dog with the specific determination of a dog who has decided the destination, and a man who has accepted this, 2 teenagers on bikes taking the corner too fast with the confidence of people for whom consequence is still theoretical. Grace said, "Daddy." He said, She said, "What is ironwood?" The question arrived the way significant questions arrive from children, without warning, without preamble, with the directness of someone for whom the social protocols that would make the question easier to ask haven't yet been installed. Cole set his cup down, looked at his daughter. She was looking at him with a spoon of strawberry ice cream held in suspension waiting. He said, "Where did you hear that?" She said, "Lily's dad. He works security at your building. He told Lily and Lily told me." Cole thought about Frank Kowalski, who had kept a secret for 11 months and had apparently made some determination at some point in the preceding weeks that the secret's usefulness had ended. He was not angry. He understood the calculation. He said, "What did Lily say it meant?" Grace said, "She said it was your secret name, like a code name. She said her dad said you used to be someone important." Cole looked at his daughter for a moment. The green ribbon in her hair from the concert, the strawberry ice cream on the corner of her mouth, the eyes brown, direct, entirely her mother's looking at him, with the specific patience of a child who has learned that her father will answer her questions honestly if she waits long enough for him to find the right words. He said, "Ironwood was a name I used when I did a different kind of work. A long time ago, before you were born." She said, "What kind of work?" He said, The kind that was important but couldn't be talked about. The kind that some people need to do so that other people don't have to. She held the spoon still and thought about this with the gravity she brought to new information. Then, like what happened in the fire. He said something like that, but in places that were harder than a building in Chicago and for a longer time and without being able to come home at the end. She said, "Is that why you stopped? Because you wanted to come home?" He looked at her. The question was more precise than any question he had been asked about this in 3 years, because it was the right question, not about what he had done or what he was capable of, but about why he had chosen to become what he had become. He thought about the 4 months of silence, the floor of her room, the oatmeal with the brown sugar that had meant something was returning and would continue to return. He said, "I stopped because you needed a father more than anyone anywhere needed what I could do, and because I realized that the most important work I would ever do wasn't something I'd be given an assignment for. I'd have to choose it myself." Grace said, "Raising me." He said, "Raising you." She ate a spoonful of ice cream, processing. Then, "Is Ironwood still in there, in you?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Does that bother you?" He thought about this honestly because she deserved the honest answer and would know the difference between the honest answer and the managed one. "No," he said. "It doesn't bother me anymore. It's part of who I am. But it's not the part that's in charge." She said, "What's in charge?" He said, "The part that picks you up from school and makes oatmeal and checks your window lock every night and sits in the 3rd row." Grace looked at him with the expression she had developed in the last year that was the expression of someone who is beginning to understand the full dimensions of a person they have always known, the specific look that arrives when a child starts to see their parent as something more complicated than the role and is deciding how to hold both versions at once. It was Cole knew the beginning of a different kind of relationship than the one they'd had when she was 4, not better or worse larger. It required more from both of them. He was glad for it. She said, "The 3rd row every time." He said, "Every time." She nodded, returned to her ice cream with the finality of a matter settled. Then, without looking up, "You're a good dad." He said, "I'm working on it." She said, "No, you are one." She said it with the authority of someone who is not offering comfort, but delivering a verdict which was a distinction she had always understood, without knowing she understood it, which was something she had gotten from her mother. He looked out the window at the ordinary street. The couple had resolved their directions and were walking together now, leaning slightly into each other against the cold. The dog walker had been pulled to a stop by a smell at the base of a lamppost that apparently required extended investigation. The teenagers on bikes were gone, their specific energy of motion already absorbed by the night. He thought about the locked room inside his chest where Ironwood lived, the skills, the precision, the particular darkness of work done in places that no daylight reached. He had not closed the lock tighter over the past weeks. He had not needed to. The work he was doing now, the camera blind spots, the badge protocols, the team that was learning to know the building the way he knew it, drew from that room without requiring him to live in it. He could open the door and take what was useful and close it again. That was not something he had known was possible when he started mopping floors. He had discovered it slowly through the accumulation of evidence that a person could be more than one thing without being divided by it. He paid for the ice cream. They put their coats on and went out into the December night. Grace took his hand, which she did automatically, without looking the way people reach for things that are always there. In the car on the way home, she fell half asleep in the passenger seat with her head against the window and the green ribbon still in her hair. He drove with the practiced attention of someone for whom the management of a vehicle is automatic enough to share space with thought, and what he thought about was Caroline Hargrove in the alley on a cold October morning, sitting on a concrete barrier in a suit that cost more than his monthly rent, asking him a question that was really a question about herself and what it meant that she had asked it anyway. He had not told Grace about Caroline. There was time for that, and the time was not now, and he had learned in the last 3 years that the right time for things was rarely the first moment they seemed possible. He had also learned that the things worth waiting for tended to make their readiness visible when they arrived. He pulled into the driveway in Cicero at 8:14, carried Grace inside, which she permitted with the limp cooperation of someone three-quarters asleep, removed her shoes, got her into bed with the practiced efficiency of a man who has performed this sequence hundreds of times and has become as good at it as anything he has ever been good at. He tucked the blanket under her chin. She said from the edge of sleep, something that might have been good night or might have been thank you. The syllables blurred the intent clear. He stood in the doorway for a moment, counted her breaths. 5, steady and even. 6, 7. Then he went through the house in order. Front door, back door, kitchen window, bathroom window, her window. Last, the one he checked most carefully, the one that would always be last. The order of it, a ritual that he had no intention of ending because it was not compulsion. It was love, expressed in the only language he had ever been fully fluent in, which was the language of making sure. He sat in the living room chair by the window. The street was quiet. The oak in the yard had lost most of its leaves since October, stood now in the spare clarity of a tree that has shed everything unnecessary and is simply itself patient and complete. He thought it was probably the most honest thing in the yard. His phone showed a text from Caroline sent at 7:59 while he had been in the ice cream shop watching Grace negotiate the existential question of whether sprinkles improved the fundamental experience or complicated it. The text said, "The board reviewed the security protocol changes today. Patterson from 36 called it the most substantive improvement in building safety culture in the organization's history. I thought you should know." A pause of 4 minutes in the text record. Then, also, "I'm working on the answer to that question. The one from the alley. I think I'm getting closer." He read it twice. Then he put the phone face down on the arm of the chair and looked out the window at the street. There were things that were still unresolved. The conversation he would eventually have with Grace about the more complete version of who her father had been. The door inside him that was not fully closed and was not meant to be the part of him that was ironwood permanent and present and no longer a problem. The relationship with Caroline that had begun in an alley with an apology and had continued in the specific way that two people continue when they have seen each other clearly in a moment of difficulty and found the view worth returning to. These were all in motion. Motion was good. Motion meant something was alive. He thought about what Frank had said in a parking garage the previous week between shifts in the offhand way that Frank said the things he actually meant. "You know what the difference is between the man I met in this building 16 months ago and the man who showed up to that team meeting? The one 16 months ago was doing a job. The one last week was being something." Cole had not responded to this at the time. He had thought about it since in the spaces between other things. He understood the difference Frank was pointing to. He had arrived here trying to disappear, which was a form of protection and also a form of waste, and he was leaving that version behind, not in a single moment, but in the slow accumulation of choices that added up to a direction. The direction was not back to what he had been. It was not purely forward to something new. It was the thing that existed when a person stopped dividing their life into before and after and started letting it be continuous, all of it. The darkness and the ordinary morning and the concert in the gymnasium and the ice cream in December and the locks checked in order every night, all of it. One thing, all of it his. He had not failed a mission, not once. The record held. He closed his eyes. He let the quiet street do what quiet streets do, which is to be the sound of a life arranged around something that matters, unremarkable from the outside and irreplaceable from within. Somewhere down the block a dog started and stopped. A car passed with music briefly audible and then gone. The furnace clicked on with the familiar sound of a system that worked. He had chosen a floor and a mop and the smallest possible life, and the smallest possible life had turned out to contain everything. This was not what he had expected. He had not expected anything. He had simply put one foot in front of the other in the direction of his daughter, and the direction had become a life, and the life had become, without his quite deciding it would, something he was glad to be living. There was nothing left to figure out tonight. There was only the ordinary continuation of a Wednesday in December in a house in Cicero, Illinois, where a 7.5-year-old who counted the halves was asleep in the next room, and a man who had been a ghost and a weapon and a secret had made himself into something far more difficult to achieve and far more worth being. Her father. 3 syllables. The strongest name he had ever carried, and the only one he intended to keep.